We come to Lesson 45, the diagram for Matthew. We see at once the name of Jesus. Of course, the Gospels are all centered in Jesus. But our approach is so intellectual and so cold. This man, God on earth, is someone that we must meet personally, who must become the center of our lives, who must fill our minds with His truth, and we must constantly be in worship of this man, God, Jesus, which takes us far beyond this kind of cold, intellectual thing that we are doing here, which we've said from the first is merely an overview. It cannot begin to complete what each of you students needs to have, but it is an overview. We're flying high. Matthew has, as each one of these Gospels does, its own view, its own presentation of Jesus. And as the two concentric ovals suggest, there is a coherence here in Matthew. It has been thought early in the church, and even up until 1961, that Matthew, the tax collector, was the author of this book. He does certainly make his mark on it, but perhaps, as the scholars now believe, presents only the bare bones, that another editor has filled in those bones. However, the mark of Matthew cannot be taken off of it. We know that as a tax collector, he could write and speak both Aramaic and Greek, that he would have been a person who liked to collect writings, put things down in order, and so those bare bones are certainly here. The editor, a Jew also from Jerusalem, had his interests at heart in forming the rest of this book, and as you see up there at the top, this book of Matthew, this Gospel, is one of the three that are called synoptic. That means that they can be seen together, and they often are placed together in columns so that you have an overview of all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and find that many of these verses are shared by all three. Matthew uses 601 of Mark's 661 verses, but he adds 300 verses that are found only in Matthew, so there's another source, and he shares with Luke 250 verses. So there is definitely an overlap with these three Gospels. John is quite different. It does not line up synoptically with these three. But Matthew has a very clear indicator of interest. It's a Jewish interest. The Old Testament roots of this book clearly line Jesus up in the Davidic kingdom according to the law of Moses. The writer has 29 quotes from the Old Testament, often saying to fulfill what is written, Jesus said, or Jesus did. And we'll find that even in Zechariah, it says that the Messiah will last be seen on the Mount of Olives, which Jesus tends to fulfill. for his trial was even probably held there in the house of the high priest on the Mount of Olives. Also, there is the belief even today that he will be returning on the Mount of Olives. He's presented as the new Moses. We see over and again incidents in the life of this new Moses that lines up with Moses of the Old Testament, beginning with the death of the innocents. All of the baby boys at the time of Moses were being put to death by the Pharaoh of Egypt. Here we have Herod killing all the baby boys under 2 years. There's the words that out of Egypt God will call his son, and we see Joseph taking the baby Jesus and his mother away from Herod's influence. And most importantly for this book, we have a sermon from a mountain. We have a new law from a mountain. Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount giving the new law to his people. Importantly, when Jesus is tempted by Satan, he presents 3 quotes from the Old Law, Deuteronomy, Moses' words, to refute Satan who is tempting him. Jesus is fulfilling Deuteronomy 18:15, where Moses says, "Watch for someone who is coming." We're looking for that one all the way through the Old Testament. Look for one who is coming and obey what he tells you. Here is the new Moses, Jesus. So in line with that, the writer compiles out of Matthew's Q document, which is not still extant, but it looks like Matthew collected Jesus' sayings in 5, shall we say, books? Well, those 5 books of discourses and preaching are all lined out in your synopsis on the next couple pages in your study. So we have an attempt to gather Jesus' teachings into 5 books so that he will be lined up as the new Moses, the one that Moses foretold. Then, of course, the 40 days in the wilderness, Elijah, Moses, all experienced those 40 days of fasting and prayer. So Jesus is the one that has been awaited, the Messiah. He will be born in Bethlehem. The Davidic kingdom was foretold from the first, born in Bethlehem. The genealogy that Matthew lays out is in 3 groups of 14s. Very interesting that the word David, D-W-D in Hebrew, or I suppose in Aramaic also, if transcribed into the letters being numbers, adds up to 14. And there are 3 groups of 14, all linking Jesus' genealogy to the promised Davidic kingdom, David. There are new mothers listed. One is a Canaanite, the other is a Moabitess, and their actual living is not according to Jewish law. If we see a prostitute and a foreigner among them. But Jerusalem is pointed out as the holy city, and it is where this king will come to reign and be denied and be hung on a cross, where his true kingship will appear in the resurrection. Jesus is the King. And he often says, "But I say to you," in a very kingly fashion. So here are the Old Testament roots that point to a new kind of Messiah, Jesus. But special interest is the church. This is the only one of the Gospels that has the word church, and it is said several times. Actually, Matthew 16:16 has Peter's authority over the church. We saw that Peter in Mark is already in Rome, which will be the new Jerusalem for the new church, and here his authority is given by Jesus. He will be named the Rock. Mark does not say anything about this, and probably because it is Peter's gospel, you would say, well, why didn't Peter say, "I was named Rock, and I was given authority over the church"? Well, that would have been a very vain-sounding thing. So that is already assumed. But Matthew will tell it, when it happened and where, that Peter is named Peter, Rock. He's established by Jesus according to the Davidic kingdom. Those words in 16:16 come from Isaiah 22:22, describing the role of the chief officer in David's kingdom, the one who had control of the keys, as being Peter in the new Davidic kingdom. So now our diagram begins to take place because there is this interest in church and Jesus' formation of the church with Peter's authority. And with this we should look at Acts chapters 2, 3, and 4, because this describes what is going on in Jerusalem in that primitive church. They are gathering for prayer and the breaking of bread, the early Mass. Those chapters are very important for you to look up, because this is the new Davidic kingdom, and it is meant for all people, but it is especially has a concern for the Jews because it is a Jerusalem church. So, they are the lost sheep. We have references there that Jesus brings to the Jews, and it does condemn Jews who resist. We will find that Matthew he is not quite as blunt as the gospel according to Peter. Peter, you remember that word, he's always in a hurry, and he is not caring about how his words may sound to some people. And now some time has gone by. We see we're dating this, I think, before 70 at the fall of the temple, because it would seem that the death of Peter and the death of Paul in 65 would somehow have been noted if this had been written after that. It seems like it must have been written before. In that regard, in the writing of these synoptic gospels, it is interesting to surmise, because all of these men who wrote this, certainly Matthew and Mark and Luke, knew each other. The writer, the editor of Matthew, knew Mark and Luke. However, though they had that association from early times, They are now separate from each other, which is a very good thing, because these three Gospels, well, actually we'll put the fourth in there, each have their own way of presenting the impact of Jesus. Mark is writing from Rome. Mark. This editor of Matthew and Matthew himself are interested in Jerusalem. Luke is a traveler, a missionary with Paul. When he wrote his book, the Gospel of Luke, we're not sure just where he was. He may have been writing it while his boss, St. Paul, was in prison. Some of it he may have gathered while Paul was in Caesarea. Or he may have been writing it when Paul was also a prisoner in Rome. But they are separate. John, of course, is in Ephesus when he writes his. But then what is the relationship with the mother of Jesus to these writers of the Gospel? They all would have known her. And at this point, she would be living with John in Ephesus, is the old tradition. So this interrelationship, yet separation, is very important in understanding the presentation of these marvelous Gospels. Now, what is the interest of the writer of Matthew in Jesus' words, and what is his concern? It is with Jesus now surrounded by those two concentric, what are they there? Not circles. They're there to show us that there is the formation now of a church, a group of people adhering to Jesus and wanting only to follow him in the most sincere, deep, personal way possible. But in forming a church, we have difficulties arising. If you belong to a church, which I certainly hope you do, you will know that these difficulties don't go away, because human beings bring difficulties in their relationships. And there were a number of questions raised by the converts in this infant church, and they are still raised. Let's look at these 11 down here on your diagram. These are the questions that Matthew tries and succeeds mostly in explaining. If Jesus came for the Jews, why did they reject him? And why are Gentiles accepting him? You know the story that Jesus tells of the parable about the wineskins, that if you put new wine in old skins, it will burst them and they both will be ruined. So the Jews have become content like an old wineskin. They do not want new wine. But the Gentiles have no old wineskin, so they are easily accepting him. All right, point 2. Did those who came into the church early have a better rank? Isn't that a good story? What about the fellow who only worked a few hours and got the same wage? There will be no ranking in the church. Why didn't Jesus prove his authority with great signs? Well, the sign has to fall on good ground in order to root. We have this parable of the soils. We can see that those roots have to find prepared soil. How about those who accept Jesus but don't first live the law? There is a new law. It is the law of the Sermon on the Mount. How do we settle disputes in the new community? There's an instruction for that in the 18th chapter. First, you go to the person. If he won't listen to you, you take another fellow from the church to talk to him. If he won't accept that, you take the whole matter to the church. Why is Jesus causing so much stress in families, and isn't this still happening? He foretold it. He told us that it would, that there would be this upheaval over him in families. Why don't the Orthodox Jews and those well-trained in Scripture believe? Again, it's because they are content with what they have. They want nothing to disturb that. And why is there so much evil alongside of the good? When Jesus, the Son of God, came, why didn't he end evil? He tells us that until the end of time, you can't uproot evil without uprooting good. Think of this in your family. If Jesus would uproot those in the family who are obstreperous, it would only cause grief everywhere. Why is the Jewish law relaxed for the Gentiles? They are a new body. They are not going to have to follow the Jewish law. There is a new law, and it's the law of the Sermon on the Mount, which is love. And what is the follower's relationship to the temple? Well, Jesus addresses that in a couple of places. If it's a matter of Rome, show me a coin whose face is on it, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And so what is a follower's relationship to Jewish scribes and Pharisees? Do what they tell you because it's out of the old law of Moses, but don't do what they do. So here are some of the problems raised by converts in the infant church that are addressed by this particular gospel that has the church in mind. It is all preparing us for the second coming, which is well described in chapters 24 and 25. The church is still on the 2,000-year march toward the second coming. It still is raising questions which Jesus will answer if brought to him. The church is the new Jerusalem. It is the new Davidic kingdom, and its king is in charge. It is Israel, the new Israel, but with a difference.